It might fall on you.
شنو قفل انت ليش؟
Okay, let's get on to it. I'll finish the lecture and we'll do the questions for the exam. How does that sound? Okay.
No.
خلاص خربان
Okay.
درجات والله خربان كل واحد يحسب درجته بالاخطاء او
Oh, the board is wet.
اقول لي نسى يعني ايش اسوي يعني
خلاص
Okay, I'll want right on the board because it's wet. All right, so yesterday I think we were on this slide here, okay? We finished that, didn't we? Yeah, so remember that somatic cells, normal cells in the human body that are not gametes or sperm or egg are diploid. That means they have 2n number of chromosomes. Yes.
Testes is the same with sperm.
So sperm,
And testes.
no. Testes is the organ where the sperm is made.
Okay.
But it's plural for testicle, okay? An egg is made in the ovaries, okay? So this is with the cell and this is the organ where it's made, okay? So we've got 2n number, which is referring to diploid, which means that one n came from the mother and one n from the father. So during fertilization, the n from the mother and the n from the father join together to form 2n. You get diploid number. Haploid join together to form diploid. So in the zygote. Then you have the haploid cells. You find only these in the gametes, the sperm or the egg. So these are formed in the gonads. Now gonads is a collective term to describe these testes and ovaries, okay? So it's referring to the testes and the ovaries. So in this instance we have cells that are n. That means they have half the number of chromosomes. So 23 chromosomes instead of 46. So 23 single, and here we have 23 pairs, okay? So, you know, we talked about these homologous pairs, okay?
Yeah.
So in the diploid, we have the homologous pairs, and in haploid, we have one of the homologous pairs, okay? So it becomes 23. Now, in human diploid cells, we have 46 chromosomes, so 23 pairs. The 22 homologous pairs, okay, the non-sex chromosomes, we call them autosomes, okay? So we find that both in male and female is the same, okay? And then we have the sex chromosomes. We've got one pair of that, so 2 chromosomes. So in female, it's XX, in male, XY, so different. And as I mentioned yesterday, that the male determines the gender of the child. And interesting fact, I mentioned it before, I'll mention it to the whole classroom, that this was discovered only about 100 or so years ago by Natalie Stevens and Edmund Beecher. They found that the female is XX and the male is XY. But, as I mentioned before, in the Quran we have a verse in Surah 53, ayat 45 to 46, which says that Allah created male and female from a sperm emitted. So the discovery of modern science that sex is determined by the male was already known to us 1400 years ago in the Quran.
Yes.
And as I mentioned, the exact verse is number 46 in Surah 53, verse 46. Very interesting that it should be verse 46 because we have 46 chromosomes. Alhamdulillah. See, so when we look at the Quran, we find many scientific facts, and this is one of them that Allah has revealed to us 1400 years ago, while it's now been discovered only recently. So that's an interesting fact I'd like to share with you guys. So when you read the Quran, see some things in there that are very scientific, and you look at it and they only have been discovered recently. Another thing is, Allah says that He created all living things from water, in another place. And we know now that most living things, they cannot survive without water. They made up their body content, or their structure is made up of mostly water. In humans, we learned 60-70% water. So it's another interesting fact. All right, so let's move on. So if you have a look at the human gametes, as I mentioned before, they're haploid. So they have the 23 single chromosomes of the pairs that you received from the mother or father. So during gametogenesis, or the formation of sperm or egg, the homologous pairs separate. Okay, so you got in each sperm or egg 23 single chromosomes. Okay, so when we look at them, we find in the haploid 22 of those chromosomes are the autosomes, and then the sex chromosomes, one chromosome. Okay, so in the ovum, so that's another term used to describe the egg or the ova. Okay, one X chromosome, because the female can only provide XX. So all ova or ovum contain X chromosome. They cannot contain Y. So in case of the sperm, it provides XY. Okay. So because males have XY chromosomes, so the sperm can have a 50% chance of either being X or Y. And this is how the gender of the child is determined by the sperm itself. Okay? So any questions on that? So you see here, you had diploid number of cells, okay? Diploid number of chromosomes, 2n. And then during sperm or egg formation, the number of chromosomes is halved. So homologous chromosomes separate. You end up with 23 chromosomes. All right, so we got a little activity here. Let's test your knowledge on that chapter. Should be easy for you. All right, give me some example of a somatic cell.
Human.
An example of a cell, not an organism.
Oh, red blood cell.
Red blood cell, what else?
Nerve cell.
Nerve cell,
Nerve cell.
you know, epithelial cells, muscle cells, fibroblasts, white blood cells, and so on, okay? These are somatic cells. In case the red blood cell, I should mention, is formed from a somatic cell. It actually has no nucleus, so it might not fit into this category somehow, okay? Because when we look at the number of chromosomes, we don't find any chromosomes in red blood cell, okay? So a lot of those cells that have that are our body cells, except for, what are the gametes?
Egg.
Egg and sperm, correct? So we got the egg and the sperm, okay? How many autosomes do we find there?
22.
22 what? 22 pairs, okay? 22 pairs of autosomes are found in the somatic cells. What about in the gamete? How many? 22 single chromosomes, okay? So the total number of chromosomes, 46, 23, okay? So number of sex chromosomes we find in the somatic cells? One pair or two, okay? One pair or two. What about in here? One chromosome, the sex chromosome. Is this a haploid or diploid? Diploid, so it means it got 2n, correct?
Yes.
Here,
Haploid.
haploid, n. How many homologous pairs of chromosomes?
It has 2.
How many homologous pairs?
Oh, 23.
23 pairs. What about here?
23
What we, let's come back here. 23 pairs in what? In male?
Oh, yeah.
Or female?
Female.
Female, okay? So 23 homologous pairs in female, while we find 22 homologous pairs in one different pair of X and Y, one X and Y, okay? So in terms of humans, we're talking, there's 22 pairs of homologous chromosomes. In some species you might find different, okay? So, and specifically in humans, if we're talking about here, we find 22 homologous pairs in the male and an X and Y, while we find 23 homologous pairs in the female.
So
What about the gametes?
What is like same chromosomes or like
X and Y is not the same, okay? They're different chromosomes.
Okay.
But X and X is homologous pairs, okay? What about in the gametes? Do we find homologous pairs?
No.
No, it's only 23 single, okay? So it's not homologous pairs there. Everybody good with that activity? So it's a good summary of what we just learned in the previous lecture. Alright, so let's move on to the cell cycle. And as I mentioned earlier, the cell cycle is very important for growth, development, tissue repair, regeneration. So these sort of processes require the cell cycle to make new cells, okay? So the cell cycle has many steps, and we're gonna go through one by one what each step is and what is involved or what occurs in each of those steps of the cell cycle. So remember, one of the theories of the cell was that the cells came from pre-existing,
Yeah.
and this cycle is important for that, the cell cycle, okay? So in the cell cycle we have two major phases, okay? The interphase is between cell division, okay? So this big phase here, so this is where the cell spends most of its time, in the interphase. You see it's very long. And the actual division, or the mitotic phase, we call it, is very short. Because you don't want the cell to spend too long, and then once it starts dividing, it needs to happen very rapidly and quickly. So the actual mitosis phase is very short, while the cell is doing its normal activity. We call that the interphase. That's the longest phase, okay? So if there was a question in the exam, which phase is the longest, you would say the interphase, not the mitotic phase. So the interphase is a period where the cell is doing its normal metabolic activity. It's between the mitotic phase. So as soon as mitosis finishes, interphase begins, then until the next mitotic phase, okay? Then it starts again over. So it's between the mitotic phase, the interphase. The mitotic phase is the nuclear and cytoplasmic division, okay? So you get nuclear division, mitosis, and the cytoplasmic division, which we call cytokinesis. So for two new cells, you need to first divide the nucleus, okay? Then you need to divide the cytoplasm equally to have two new identical cells. So this is the mitotic phase. So as I mentioned, it's the longer period, the interphase between the two cell divisions, okay? So you have the cell division here, completed. Then you have interphase, and then you have the next cell division, so between the two, okay? Do you understand what that means, between the two?
No.
What?
You have one cell division, okay?
Okay.
Interphase starts, continues, and until you have the next
Okay.
second. So between two cell divisions is the interphase, okay? So that's what that means, all right? So we have this divided into different subphases. We got G1, we call that first gap, or the first growth phase, it can also be mean. Then you have the synthesis. This is where the DNA is synthesized, okay? G2 is the second gap, or the second growth phase, all right? So if we have a look at here, we have G1, then the S, and then the G2, okay? And important processes happen here in each one of these that are getting the cell ready for mitotic division, okay? So this is important for processes happening at each one of those sub-phases, okay? So we'll have a look at the first gap phase. So this is the just after the mitotic division, the G1 starts, okay? So it's the very active phase, because in this phase, the cells have just divided, okay? And they're smaller than the parent cell that came. So it's growing, it's getting larger, it's duplicating organelles, okay? So it happens, so the cell is the smallest here, okay? So if you ask you in the exam at which stage is the cell the smallest, you will say at the beginning of G1, okay? So the cell is the smallest at the beginning of G1. It will be the largest at the end of G2, okay? So this is the period we find it's between the last cell division and the S phase, okay? So that period here. And as I mentioned, the cell is growing very actively, okay? And it's trying to duplicate the organelles, getting ready for the next cell division. So, you know, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi, ribosomes, and so on are duplicating. Also, I had a look at the literature and found that the centrosome begins to duplicate in this phase here, and then, you know, the centrosome, the centrioles, important for spindle formation, okay? So the centrosome, which is one of the organelles, okay, also duplicates in this phase, the G1 phase. So then we have the, as I didn't mention this before, some cells, they can permanently enter a G0 phase, a cell where the cell cycle is arrested. It means it's stopped, okay? Like nerve cells and osteocytes. And this happens in this sort of cells after adolescence, after puberty, okay? These cells permanently become neurons or osteocytes, and they can no longer enter the cell cycle and divide, okay? So they're permanently arrested in the cell cycle, and we call this, it's out of the cell cycle, we call it G0, okay?
I didn't understand.
So in this G0, these type of cells, neurons and osteocytes, they can never enter the cell cycle again. These cells cannot form new cells.
Yeah.
Okay?
So nerve cells and brain cells and things?
So neurons and osteocytes, okay? Neurons. We're not talking about the whole of brain cells, you know, because remember we talked about the neuroglia. So neuroglia can replenish, but neurons, no. Okay? So that's why, you know, when somebody has an injury in their spine, it doesn't repair. They won't be able to walk again, because these cells can no longer enter the cell cycle and regenerate. Remember I said the cell cycle is important for regeneration? In this particular tissue, it's not going to happen, okay? So it's more, these cells in G0, they spend their time now in normal metabolic activity, okay? They don't waste their time on dividing, okay? So whatever their function is, they spend their time on the normal function, okay? So they no longer spend energy or time on the cell cycle, they're more metabolically active, okay? So is that clear what the G0 is? Yeah. It's a stage of the cell cycle they enter where the cells no longer are able to divide. So examples are the neurons and the osteocytes. Remember the osteocytes in the bone?
Yes.
From last chapter? These type of cells, they and this happens after, you know, adolescence, okay? After when you become an adult. So they can no longer enter G1 or the S or G2 phase. So they're stuck in G0. All right? Okay, so the second phase, sub-phase of interphase, the S phase, this is where you get DNA replicated, okay? Because remember that the chromosomes need to be separated, duplicated chromosomes, into two new identical daughter cells. So to do that, we need to make a copy of the DNA. So in the S phase, a copy of the DNA is made, okay? So we get a DNA replication, the process of DNA replication, which we will learn about later on. It actually happens in the S phase. So you get synthesis of DNA for the next cell division, okay? Ready to divide, okay, the cell. You get slower growth in the G1 phase because most of the energy is spent on making the DNA, okay? So the cell is trying to duplicate the DNA. There's a slower growth, okay? But it still continues. Then we enter the final subphase of interphase, the G2 phase, the second gap phase. So you get growth, but it's slower because it's preparing the cell to enter mitosis, cell division, okay? And in this, at the end of this, in the late stages of this phase, right about here, you start to get the first appearance of the chromosomes, okay? Right at the end of it, just before the beginning of the mitotic phase, okay? So you get it's slow growth. It's preparing for cell division. So this is where the DNA forms these starts to coil and condense, starting to form the chromosomes. Okay. How much time do we have?
20 minutes.
20 minutes. Okay. I'll continue the lecture, but first, you can stop that video now. I'll give you the